Good evening, Vernon. Welcome to the Lodge Hope of Karachi, number 337, and our lockdown lecture series on this glorious 1st of June evening. Bern, as ever, can I remind you of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidelines? Please keep your camera on and a recognisable name within the little box. If you do have some challenges with your broadband and your bandwidth, please just drop me a little message. But I'm sure that we won't in this glorious weather because everybody's outside and not playing on their Xboxes and things like that and stealing your bandwidth. Bern, as usual, can I ask you to sign the virtual tile on our Facebook pages? It's very much appreciated. It helps us build up the record of these meetings. Bern, it's a great pleasure this evening to welcome a brother from our own constitution. We've had a couple of Americans from across the water over the last couple of weeks, but I felt it would be nice to bring a Scot back to the table. But just to keep in with the nautical themes, I thought I'd get a Scot from an island, so at least he's coming from across the water to us. He's coming from the little island of Cumbria on the west coast of Scotland. So those of you in Largs, if you look out your window and you can wave out the window across the sea, you can see Cumbria, I'm sure. One of the things at the Lodge Hope of Karachi that we have tried to do is inspire up-and-coming lecturers to write their own work. And although we cannot take any credit for Scott being a younger member of the craft and an up-and-coming, but we would like to congratulate him on all his efforts that he has done in terms of research. Just a little bit about Scott. As I said, he lives on the small island of Cumbria. He's an artist. He's a firefighter. He tells me he's an ex-serviceman, but he's been modest because he actually served in the intellectual, the good-looking part of Her Majesty's Forces, the Royal Air Force. He's a keen researcher of Masonic history and particularly the origins of Freemasonry in Scotland and its influence across the globe. He's written a short book on William Shaw, the Master of Works, to King James VI, and he has his own free newsletter called the Masonic Artist Tracing Board, and we'll hear more about that this evening, Brian. He has his own website, which I'll put up in the chat, and I would recommend you all to have a look at that at some point at your convenience. So it's with great pleasure I welcome along Brother Scott Watson, the Worshipful Senior Warden of Lodge Kelburn, number 459. Brother Scott, the virtual floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Brother Gordon. And brethren, it's excellent to be here tonight. I really appreciate this. I have given this presentation to a number of different groups, but it's actually nice to be able to give this presentation to a group in Scotland and to see so many familiar faces and hear so many Scottish voices has been quite nice on the build-up. Can we just test that I can share my screen, Gordon? Is that okay? It should work. Yeah. So tonight's presentation, brethren, is on the art of Masonic tracing boards in craft Freemasonry. I am a Freemason myself. I'm the Worshipful Senior Warden of Lodge Kelburn, number 459. And as tonight's presentation is being recorded and potentially accessible to members outside of the craft, the things that we will be discussing and going through tonight will indeed be at that level. I would like to thank Gordon for his superb arranging of this and making everything very easy on me. I've experienced giving this presentation to many different people, and it varies vastly across the board as to how smoothly it goes. And Gordon, I would like to say thank you very much for your effort in pulling this together. It's been greatly appreciated. So normally I would start with a joke at this point about speaking funny and the observant noticing that I'm from Scotland, but I don't think that's really relevant to this particular audience tonight. So we'll move swiftly on with this, and for those that are maybe not familiar with their Scottish geography, I live on the Isle of Cumbria, Millport, and it's Lodge Kelburn number 459. We are actually the smallest island in a sort of a geographic sense to have a working lodge in Scotland. So we had to do a wee bit of digging around to find that one out, but it's one of our few claims to fame. As Gordon said, I am an artist myself. I draw in pencil. I picked up a pencil 2 years ago and started drawing again. I'm also a firefighter, and thank you for the reminder on that one, Gordon, because I'd forgotten to take the battery out of my pager, so that could have gone off at any point there. And I'm also an ex-serviceman. I was in the Royal Air Force for 10 years. I returned home to the island about 7 years ago, and despite being an analyst for many years and loving nothing more than a cup of coffee and a database full of numbers, I am a creative at heart. And before I'd even picked up a pencil again, I was fascinated by the arts in all sorts of, all shape and form, be it music, be it traditional visual arts. And naturally, being a Freemason, the art of Freemasonry has always piqued my interest for that reason. This is a small selection of some of my work, just seizing the opportunity to put it out there. These are all drawn in graphite pencil. For those familiar with Millport, you'll recognise the Crocodile Rock up on the left-hand side, or the Royal George down in the middle. And I've done a variety of different commissions over the last sort of 2 years or so, and I've considered myself very, very lucky that people actually commission me to do these drawings and like to hang them on their wall. Today, however, I would like to talk about the art of a Masonic tracing board, and in particular in craft Freemasonry. Anyone that knows me will know that I've started to develop more than a slight obsession with a Masonic tracing board. I find them fascinating, and I think it's something that as a Freemason we can apply to our daily lives, and I'll actually touch on that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. But before we start to get into the artistic side of it, I would like to go through the history and the development of tracing boards, so that we sort of understand where they've come from. Usually, I find with any part of Freemasonry, and particularly a historical part of Freemasonry, that definitions are important, and they're a good starting point for any sort of presentation. What are we actually talking about when we say a Masonic tracing board? A tracing board is the Masonic equivalent of a PowerPoint or an infographic that you would find on the internet today. It's a visual representation of the lodge within which we contain the symbols and for members of the craft to interpret and to moralise upon. It is in essence an educational chart. It can be used in many different ways, but each of them is as a Masonic educational chart. And whilst they're not as common as they once were, they are still an integral part of Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is, after all, if we use the classic quote, a system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. And it's that last bit, the illustrated by symbols, that the tracing boards are dealing with and that we're going to be looking at tonight. Today, there are 3 main tracing boards in craft Freemasonry, with countless variations of each, representing the 3 degrees. There are, however, other tracing boards for other orders and across various countries and jurisdictions. We won't really be looking at them tonight. We're going to stick to the 3 principal degrees. So trestle board or tracing board? Now, this question is probably as old as the tracing board itself. I should start by saying that what I'm about to give is my opinion. Okay, and I reckon you probably hear this a lot from speakers. I do not speak for any particular Masonic body, etc. For every 5 Masons that agree with me on this particular point that I'm about to make, there's probably another 7 out there that disagree and have their own opinions. And hopefully by the end of this, you will be able to form your own opinion on this. Today, whether we use the term trestle board or tracing board is a sort of provincial or jurisdictional preference. They tend to be used interchangeably and essentially mean the same thing. But I don't believe this was always the case. The trestle board was actually something that the tracing board would have been placed upon in old times. And the tracing boards were something completely different from what we would call them today. So the trestle, or the trassel as it was known, likely comes from either Old Scots or more likely French. And it describes a beam or a support which would go underneath a table or a board of some kind. And if you think today we have trestle tables, I actually feel quite comfortable talking about a trestle table in Scotland. Sometimes when you speak to some organisations elsewhere, they don't have trestle tables. But if you think about a trestle table today, it gives you a fair idea of what we're talking about when we refer to a trestle. The term trestle board actually predates tracing boards in the context of Freemasonry by at least 40 years. And anyone that does any sort of historical work into Freemasonry will know that 40 years is a long, long time in Freemasonry. And that is actually just the first time that that term was recorded. It was probably in use long, long before that. If we look at the frontispiece of Anderson's Constitutions from the 1784 edition, which is on the left-hand side here, this is a good example of what is thought to be a trestle board. And it's literally a board placed upon two trestles. I don't know if you can see my cursor on, unfortunately. Hopefully it shows up, but if the cursor shows up, the trestles are seen here on the left and right of the board, with the board placed along the top of it. And this would have been used to raise the symbols up off the floor. And as we find out in slides that are to come, a lot of the development of tracing boards would have come from a time where the symbols were actually drawn upon the floor. And although the evolution of this kind of thing is not linear by any shape or form, lifting it off of the floor onto trestles would have been the most natural progression for that custom. If we look at the 1820 example of a tracing board, this has been designed by Brother John Harris. And we can see that in the middle of the, apologies, just going to, we can see that in the middle of the slide here. Brother John Harris, we're going to hear about later on. And he was very, I was going to say famous there. He is famous in the respect that he's one of the most well-known artists of tracing boards in the history of Freemasonry. This is actually more what we would expect to see today in a lodge in Scotland or indeed across the world. The difference here is that between the Ionic and the Corinthian pillar on the right-hand side, we actually have a drawing board. And again, I'm just going to highlight that if you can see it. And it's a bit of white paper on a brown drawing board, and there's some sort of plan that has been placed onto this. Now, sometimes in history, this is referred to as a drawing board. Other times, it's actually referred to as a tracing board, upon which the master would lay out his plans for the work that lies ahead. So in this particular instance, we have a tracing board that has a tracing board within it. And that's something that we see a couple of times throughout the history. This is on the right-hand side here in 1755, we have a painted copy of a painting that actually shows the master sitting in front of a tracing board on a trestle, drawing out his plan. And it looks a little bit artistic for what some of the plans would probably have been in those days. But this gives you an idea of how a drawing board would probably have been used by operative Masons. At this point, I would normally say, are you confused? Welcome to Masonic history. Nothing's ever as clear as it would seem to be. And that's certainly, as a newcomer to Masonic research, I've found that it's very easy to go down rabbit holes and to get confused on this type of thing. And based on what I know about the audience today, I'm sure you've all experienced that at one stage. So where did all this come from and how did it develop? Like most things in Freemasonry, the origins belong to a time where record keeping and the thoughts towards any sort of archiving led a little bit to be desired, leaving us today in 2021 to make what we like to think are educated guesses. To understand the development of a tracing board, we need to go back to the early 18th century. Freemasonry at this point was very different to what we would recognise it in most jurisdictions today, and the way things were done, the phrases that were used, and indeed their meaning. The term the lodge, for example, today to most members of the craft they would tell you that the lodge was the building, that the home was that was home to Masonic meetings, or the gathering of brethren themselves. However, in the early 1700s, it was much more metaphorical or symbolic in nature. It was common for lodges at this time to meet in taverns as opposed to any sort of purpose-built residence. They'd be held in a shared space, maybe a hall above the tavern, where non-members could be using it before and after the meetings. Carpets at this time were completely unheard of, and the form of the lodge, which we will look at shortly, would be drawn onto the bare floorboards in either chalk or charcoal. And the suggestion is that this has actually evolved from a time where lodges were holding outdoor meetings, either in open space or in a hut, and the form of the lodge would be drawn in the dirt. And there are some examples. I believe it's the Lodge of Aberdeen has an example of meetings being held outdoors. And I've actually learned from this that throughout the world, there are still some lodges that purposefully do this in their jurisdiction, maybe once or twice a year for old time's sake. The form of the lodge would be most regularly drawn by the tiler, for which he was paid as part of his tiler's fee. And throughout the 18th century, and even into the 19th century, we see minutes and financial entries that show this. The form of the lodge would be drawn onto the floor, and then the symbols would be drawn within this form. And we've got some visual representations of what that might look like slightly later on. As this progressed, these symbols would be placed rather than drawn, and the purpose of this was for the guidance and instruction of the brethren who gathered around it, and in particularly the newly admitted apprentice. So already we can see similarities here. The brethren would stand around the drawing on the floor, and the master or whoever was giving the presentation would instruct the brethren on what was happening within the form of the lodge. And if we look at a tracing board today, if a tracing board is used as part of a lecture, then the candidate or the apprentice would stand in front of the tracing board and would be educated on the lessons and the secrets within. Now, the earliest reference that we have to a tracing board or a trestle board isn't actually a tracing board itself.
Sorry, you're feeding back very badly just now.
Okay. I'm not really sure. Has it gone away?
That's better, yeah.
It's better. Not sure if it's maybe something to do with okay, we'll try there. If it happens again, I've got a couple of settings I can maybe try to change. The earliest reference that we have isn't actually a tracing board or a minute itself. It's actually a piece of art, and the piece of art is on the screen at the moment. This was created in 1723, and I actually looked at this a while back in my newsletter. This was done by an artist called William Hogarth. Now, Hogarth would later become a Freemason. However, at the time of creating this drawing or this etching, he wasn't. And this is actually called the Mystery of Masonry, brought to light by Ye Gormajohns. And despite not being a Freemason at this time, he quite clearly knows his subject matter. And I'm sure, brethren, as you have a look at this image, you'll start to spot a few recognised symbols and hints as to what's going on. It's a satirical piece that made light of the events and the relationship that surrounded Freemasonry and an anti-Masonic group known as the Gormajons. What's interesting in particular for us today is that in the middle and on the donkey, we actually have a couple of symbols hanging from there. Hanging from the ladder, which is said to represent Jacob's ladder, we actually see a mop and a bucket, accompanying a square and a mallet. And the suggestion here from the artist is that the mop and the bucket are actually working tools of a Freemason. This was a common joke at the time amongst non-Masons, and is in reference to the fact that after the master had finished instructing the form of the lodge to the newly admitted apprentice, he would actually be handed a mop and a bucket to erase the form of the lodge from the floor as a lesson to keep the secrets of the craft and that no outsiders should ever learn them. The phrase, "nothing now remains," which is still in use in some jurisdictions, would be used by the brethren and the worshipful master once they're happy that all the markings had been removed from the floor. And as I say, that survives in some ritual today across the world. By this point, it's almost certain that this was not a new custom and it had actually been around for several years. It was there and known enough that non-Masons had become aware of it, and in 1725, so 2 years before the Karmic Manuscript that we're about to look at shortly, there's a catechism called A Dialogue with Philip and Simon. We actually hear about how this process of drawing the form of the lodge had evolved so that it wasn't just drawing the symbols, but it was actually placing a thin silver or tin symbol upon the floor and within the lodge. This particular image actually has a lot hidden within it, and we actually have Des Agoulier, one of the former Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of England, sitting on top of the donkey here. And we have Anderson himself within the ladder. And the suggestion here is he's kissing the bare backside of Des Agoulier. So you can see where the satirical side is starting to come out in the imagery. One of the first actual representations that we have of this process of drawing the lodge is actually a couple of years later in 1727. And this is a copy from a copy of the old charges known as the Karmic Manuscript. And this has been one of the most popular aspects of this presentation when I've given it. I tend to get a lot of questions about this. And brethren, I would like to open that up to yourselves. When the presentation's finished, if you do have any questions on this, please feel free to ask them. And if I don't know the answer at the moment, I will get back to you at a future stage with an answer, or at least my thoughts on it. This is likely to have been copied from a much older document, although it has been signed by a brother Thomas Karmic, that unfortunately we know very little about, other than the fact that he owned the manuscript at one stage. Some research has been done into people who owned the manuscript following Brother Karmic, but unfortunately we don't know very much about him himself at the time. The drawing, however, is entitled This Figure Represents the Lodge, and you can actually see that at the top of the screen. What's unusual about the form of the lodge in the Karmic Manuscript, and this is just one drawing of a much larger manuscript with lots of text in it, is that it's triangular in shape. Now, this is broadly speaking unique, although as I'm going to show in the near future, we do have other examples. And the other examples, unfortunately, just are not as clear as what is actually shown in a drawing like this. We do see some evidence to support this particular form in Europe. The Sloane manuscript does talk about a three-cornered pavement, but as I say, these are not as clear as the diagram here. We also have diagrams of some minutes from lodges in Vienna that show a triangular form of the lodge as well. And in Scotland, we have the triangular form of the lodge in the form of the wardens and the master being laid out in some lodges as a triangle. And we'll look at some of that again later on. The overall design is based on an old level, with the plumb line hanging down from the centre of the level, from the top point of the triangle. And at the end of the plumb line, we have a disc which could easily and probably does represent the blazing star. This is surrounded by the points of the compass, orientated as we would find in a lodge today or on a tracing board today, with east at the uppermost part of the compass. Below this, at the bottom of the level, we have 2 rows of mosaic pavement. And this particular aspect of this drawing is really interesting, because the observant amongst you will notice that the design of the black and white squares have actually changes halfway through. I have always put this down to a mistake. I'm yet to find any sort of explanation that has a Masonic meaning as to why the design would change. It has been suggested that it could be sort of bringing into order, but as I say, I haven't found any sort of evidence to support that in a Masonic sense. What's interesting about this, though, Brother Karmic probably didn't expect us to be critiquing his work almost 300 years on, so he probably didn't pay that much attention to the pattern as he was sketching it out for his own purpose. But what is interesting is the fact that there are actually 15 black squares. And the number 15, which we will come on to in the near future, is actually significant for a number of different reasons. So it seems strange that he would deliberately put 15 squares in there, and yet the pattern is perhaps not as it should be. Picking up on the fact that there are 2 rows, this probably represents the 2 steps. In later versions of the form of the lodge, we find that there are again 3 steps, one to represent each degree in craft Freemasonry. And if this is indeed a copy of a much older manuscript, then it probably predates the addition of the 3rd degree. It's worth pointing out at this point that the term master was in use long before the introduction of the Master Mason degree, as a way of identifying stonemasons that had employees or apprentices that worked for them. And we see this as far back as the 16th century, as William Shaw, the Master of Works to King James VI, writes in his 1st and 2nd Shaw statutes. On the 3 sides of the level, towards the bottom, we see the positioning of the brethren. We have the fellow craft on the left, the masters on the right, and the entered apprentice at the foot. The warden, again, this is an ancient term that was known very well in early Scotland for what we would now, in most lodges, call the Right Worshipful Master, is found at the top of the triangle. Within the shape itself, we find the working tools of the square, the compasses, the plumb rule, mallet, the trowel, and with 2 symbols at the top of this, representing candles above them. And it has been pointed out to me by some Scottish brethren in the past that it actually looks a little bit like a skirret, which, again, trying to explain to some brethren from other jurisdictions that don't use the skirret was good fun. But it is actually, they're meant to be candlesticks with the flame at the very top of the candle. And let's not forget that the overall shape of the diagram itself represents the level. What I haven't found any evidence for, but what I think is quite interesting, is if the brethren are standing around this for the guidance and instruction, then they are literally standing on the level. And although I've never found any evidence as to the phrase meeting on the level and whether it's descended from this, I like to think that that's a nice progression, if nothing else. And if anyone does know anything about that, then I would be delighted to hear about it. Finally, around the 2 vertical edges, we have alternating numbers from left to right, 1 to 15. 15 is the symbolic number for God in Hebrew numbers, Yod-He. And best guess is that these represent the positioning of brethren as they would stand around the diagram on the floor. Now, by committing this to paper for study or for education, Brother Karmic has actually unintentionally created one of the first known examples of a tracing board. And although we wouldn't call it a tracing board, this is about 100 years before we actually see the versions that we are familiar with today. The examples that are on the screen, these were actually sent to me by a member of the Superia Audi group. And these are from minutes from Lodge Vienna and also Lodge Friedrich. And I believe these have actually been in fact, I can see it at the top there, it's from the AQC book that the screenshot has been taken. And this is an actual minute that shows the form of the lodge in the shape of a triangle with the positioning of brethren and the symbols of their offices actually detailed on the triangle itself. Now, there's no suggestion that this would actually be physically recreated on a floor or anything like that. But it is interesting to see that they have opted to draw a triangle in this form within their minutes. They weren't always triangles, however, and although the Karmic Manuscript is one of the earliest and probably one of the most detailed examples of this, it's also not the first. In 1725, we have a catechism that's called a dialogue with Philip and Simon. And again, the diagram is just one part of a much larger document that has lots of text in it. But this shows two examples of the form of the lodge. And in the so the diagram we're looking at here is the one on the left. In the uppermost diagram, the one that's in the shape of a cross, the caption next to it says, "This is the form of the lodge of the old lodges." So the dialogue with Philip and Simon.
You've got that big voice very loud again.
It's gone very loud again. Okay, let's see if we can. Let's see if we can adjust this. My apologies. If you just bear with me 2 seconds, brethren, I'll try and adjust this. My apologies.
Some of the old rockers will be getting excited, Scott. They'll be thinking you're bringing out a Slade number or something. You can see Alistair Marshall getting excited there, is that? We're getting a lot of feedback there, Scott.
Is that a lot of feedback now?
Yeah, that's none.
Okay.
That's no feedback now, that's perfect.
No feedback, but can you still hear me okay?
Can hear you when you speak. There's a little part.
Okay, hopefully that's working now, and is that better?
Carry on and we'll see how it goes, Scott.
I'll tell you what we'll do. Is that better? Can you hear me?
That's hugely better.
Hugely better, right. I've obviously changed a setting somewhere with my mic setup, and it's not liking it today. So we will resort back to the old faithful built-in microphone, if that's all right. And hopefully you can all hear me nice and clearly now. So we were talking about the form of the lodge here, which is in the shape of a cross on the left-hand side. And the caption next to this says, "This is the form of the old lodges." Now, the dialogue with Philip and Simon was actually at a time where there was a lot of reformation of Freemasonry and what Freemasonry was going on. And the purpose of this diagram is actually to compare it to the form of the lodge, which is below, which is in a rectangular form and probably more what we would expect to see today. And the caption next to that is, "This lodge is the form of the lodge following Desaguliers' Reformation." So they're actually comparing the old lodges with the newer lodges here in this one particular diagram. In the middle here, we have
the form of the lodge from 1760 from an exposure called 3 Distinct Knocks. And next to it, we have another exposure from roughly about the same time. And again, what we have here is a comparison between the lodges of the ancients and the latter being the lodge of the lodges of the moderns. We can see that the shape here is changed to more rectangular, but we can also, or oblong square, as it's often referred to. But the big difference between these two is actually the number of steps. Going back to what we said before, we have the apprentice step and the craft step on the left and the middle diagram, and we have the first, second, and third on the right-hand side. Although these diagrams are actually quite basic, they would probably have placed symbols within them, as we have seen in other examples. Now, the first half of and the middle of the 18th century was popular for Masonic exposures as the craft grew in popularity, and many of these had a frontispiece to them. Now, when we say exposure, it's not necessarily a book that is exposing Freemasonry to non-Masons, although sometimes that did happen. Sometimes these books were actually written, or manuscripts were written for the purpose of guidance and instruction within a lodge itself. So the word exposure is a little bit of a misnomer there, but we will use it for the purposes of this. And the reason that they would put a frontispiece in it is it's the first page. When you open the book or the manuscript, you are greeted with a nice attractive piece of artwork. And whilst these are not tracing boards themselves, they do have the same elements of a tracing board that we would see. And in particular, the exposure from 1751, Langley's The Builder's Jewel, this particular design actually goes on to become a tracing board design in its own right. And indeed, so does the one on the right, although that one is seen more heavily in the European lodges and is still actually used in some jurisdictions today. What you will see from this is a lot of the same elements are there. We have the pillars, we have the working tools, and in the 1741 example here, we actually once again have a tracing board within a tracing board, and we actually have the mosaic pavement. What's interesting about this, however, is the east is at the bottom, with west at the top, which in other examples we would expect to see it reversed around. Now, as many of you will have noticed, the dates jump around quite a little, and this is because lodges and various countries were developing their ritual and methods independently of each other. So there's no clear progression from the drawing of the lodge on the floor through to today's modern tracing board. However, the natural progression, if there was one, would be instead of relying on the artistic skill of the tiler, which might sometimes be questionable, instead of drawing it on the floor, they would actually start to paint it onto a cloth. And this cloth could be taken out for the various ceremonies that it was required for, placed on the ground, on the floor, and they could do the exact same thing, but without the effort of having to draw the lodge. Also, if we think about today where we square the lodge, again, I have no evidence to back this claim up, if you like, but if we think about a drawing on a floor, if you were to walk across it instead of walking around it, then there's a good possibility that you would erase what was being drawn on the floor. So it's possible, and I say possible, that the process of squaring a lodge could come from that as well. As they go on to a painted floor cloth, that's maybe not as necessary as it would have been when it was hand drawn. The earliest example of one of these cloths that we see is actually in a text called The Ceremonies of Religion and Custom. And it does actually have a French title, but I'll spare you my bad attempt at a French accent. And this was from 1733, where we can see French Masons conducting a degree and surrounding what is clearly some sort of cloth that has been placed on the floor. Now, this is actually some 30 years before the two exposures that we just looked at for the ancients and the moderns. So you can see it's not a linear progression here. This same year, 1733, the Old King's Arms Lodge number 28, in their minuted the purchase of a canvas for the proper delineation, as well as the purchase of a drawing board and tea for the use of the master of his lodge. Now, it just states the letter T. It doesn't actually expand on that anymore. So this might refer to a trestle. It might also refer to a T-square. It's unlikely to refer to a tracing board because it refers to a drawing board and a T. The minute reads, the acting master represented that whereas the institution of new brethren was attended to with more than ordinary and perhaps an unnecessary trouble, i.e. drawing it out on the floor, it was therefore moved that a proper delineation should be made on canvas and be deposited in the repository ready for those occasions. So they're trying to make their life a lot easier. They take the cloth, they store it away in a trunk. It gets taken out the trunk when they need it for a ceremony. In 1736, a floor cloth representing the several forms of the lodge is presented to the Theatre Tavern Lodge by a Brother Gouge. So already at this stage, we're starting to learn that there are several forms of the lodge, not just the one. What's particularly interesting about this picture here, in this book, there are several different images like this that show various ceremonies. And what's quite interesting about this is the far right-hand corner of this, which I'm sure, brethren, you will be able to draw your own conclusions on what that might represent with this particular ceremony. We see them again visually in the Order of French Masons. Again, I will spare you my attempt at French. This is from 1745, and we now have at least two different floor cloths, and these are actually shown in the diagrams on the right-hand side here. What's particularly interesting about these several examples is that in this particular book or exposure, the use of floor cloths is expressly forbidden. The publication itself states the lodge proper, i.e. the figures drawn on the floor on reception days, must be quite literally crayoned and must not be painted on a cloth which is kept specially for those days. And yet, as I said before, we have multiple examples of what is quite clearly a floor cloth being used. Also in 1759 in Lodge Edinburgh, they receive a report that a floor cloth was being displayed in a painter's window. And it reads, it having been represented that a painted cloth containing the flooring of a master's lodge was hanging publicly exposed in a painter's shop. And they, considering that the same might be of pernicious consequences to masonry, ordered the same to be sent for. And in regard to that use, the use of such painted floorings was expressly forbid. They instructed the Lodge St Andrews, to whom it belonged, not in future to use such floors. Now, despite this, we see lots and lots of examples of these floor cloths being used. And this is just a small selection of some of the oldest ones that we have pictures for. These were usually painted onto some sort of soft material, such as a canvas, or in the purpose of the Vienna example on the right-hand side, that's actually leather. And I believe it's a leather insert rather than what we might describe as a cloth. The idea for this was that it would ideally be rolled up and stored when not in use, and then taken out and placed on the floor with ease when it was required. What you can see, however, is these tend to get more and more detailed as time goes on, and they become pieces of art in their own right. And this is probably the first stage of truly artistic Freemasonry that we start to see. And so much so that it became common practice for these floor cloths to be hung on a wall and displayed publicly throughout a lodge meeting. And this is a custom that we still see in some lodges in America, where they have what they would call the master's carpet. It's essentially the same thing, and they actually display it on the wall in the lodge. And that's not too dissimilar to what we do in most lodges in Scotland, with displaying the tracing board, either the tracing board that is relevant to the degree we're working in at that time, or instead, as we do in my mother lodge, we display all 3 tracing boards at the same time and they remain up throughout. What's interesting about this is that, to me, tracing boards are one of the best kept secrets, because you can publicly display a tracing board with all its symbols and all its beautiful artwork, and to a non-member of the craft, they will not actually understand what a lot of it means. So the secrets are sort of hidden in plain sight, or when it comes to a tracing board. I would like to highlight on the Lodge of Hope lodge cloth in 1780. So that's the one, the larger one in the middle there. This actually has one of the first examples. My apologies, I'm jumping on there. This again has an example of a tracing board within what is essentially a tracing board. On the right-hand side, next to the vase, we can actually see what is similar to a tracing board, what we would call today, with the border, etc., around it. And we can start to see, although these are floor cloths, we can start to see where tracing boards are going to come from this. Now, this leads me very nicely on to talking about tassels, which is actually something that came up in discussion with Brother Yap. I don't know if Brother Yap is here today, but he's part of the Superior Audi group. And we were talking about tassels and the meaning of them, and why some tracing boards have 4 tassels and some of the European tracing boards actually only have 2 tassels. Now, I haven't actually found a lot about the tassels themselves, but they're usually attached on the European examples and the early examples that we see on the left here to the knotted rope. And sometimes the knot itself is referred to as the infinity knot, and the idea being that this is binding brethren together in brotherly love. And this predates the idea of tassels on a tracing board, and for example, the example we find on the far right-hand side, by a good 50 to 60 years, possibly longer. And whilst the tassels are mentioned briefly, the focus, from what I can tell, is more on the knot and the rope itself, with the tassels coming from the end of them. But what's quite interesting about this is it always seemed to dangle vertically. And it's been suggested to me that this might actually come from an operative setup, where the operative mason would dangle a line with a tassel at the end of it from every corner of the room. And it was to show that the walls were upright and plumb, and everything was fitting together correctly. So it could be that it comes from the operative side like that. Much later on, however, we do start to see the tassels being placed in each of the 4 corners of the tracing board. In fact, the earliest reference to this is 1801, so this is much later on. And it seems that this seems to be a result of attempts to standardise ritual and lectures, from which tracing boards themselves actually then evolve. And they become used to represent the 4 perfect points of entrance: guttural, pictorial, manual, and pedal, which in turn then allude to the 4 cardinal virtues of temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. The cardinal virtues, however, do not enter rituals until the late 18th century. So you can see that although today we may take for granted that this is what that means and this is what that means, this was a slow progression, that it hasn't always necessarily stood for the same thing. Beyond that, however, there is little information on this. There is Coyle's Masonic Encyclopedia of 1961, which describes each of the perfect points of entrance and goes into it in a lot more detail than I could here. So that's maybe a good reference point for anyone that is interested in following that up. So tracing boards as we know them today. So we've gone from the drawing on the floor, we've raised the drawing on the floor up off the floor onto, we've then gone to a painted cloth. We've then possibly put it onto a board with trestles, and we are now going on to tracing boards as we would probably recognise them in a lodge today. They start to appear in the final years of the 18th century and the early 19th. And the names of the designers that you're probably going to be looking at for this era would be brothers John Brown, Jacobs, John Cole, Josiah Bowring, and Arthur Thistleton. These primarily followed what became known as the chart pattern. It's very flat, and it looks like the sort of chart you would expect to see describing something nowadays in maybe a PowerPoint. It's very simple, minimalistic, and flat in their design. I wouldn't say particularly artistic, and they're not dissimilar to the floor cloths that we looked at previously. We should note that at the time that we start to see these tracing boards come in, this is the first time that we see the varying heights of the pillars. Up until this point, each of the pillars were always the same height, but Brother John Brown here in 1798 has actually made them 3 different heights. This is in accordance to actual architectural specifications, and that is that the Doric pillar is 7 diameters high, the Ionic pillar is 8 diameters high, and the Corinthian pillar is 9 diameters high. And these each represent wisdom, strength, and beauty, which we can see labelled on that particular tracing board. These tracing boards were being created in order to visualise the lectures that were being published around this time and being presented to lodges, in particular by Brother John Brown himself, who spent a lot of time and a lot of his own money travelling around lodges, mainly in England, in an attempt to standardise the ritual across the craft. The colour version that we see second from the right is from Lodge St Andrews in New York, and it's actually a painted copy of the frontispiece that we looked at earlier from Langley's The Builder's Jewel. There are a few additions, including the checkered pavement at the checkered floor at the bottom, which has, very interestingly, 3 different patterns. And if we look at the patterns that we see for the mosaic pavement throughout the development of tracing boards, it's not until much later that the chessboard style that we are so common with nowadays actually becomes the sort of the standard. The first of the artists to make a name for himself with the tracing boards was Brother John Brown, whose first edition of the Master's Key in 1798 had the crude hand-drawing tracing boards that we looked at on the previous slide. These colour versions are actually from his second edition of the text. In his first degree board, we see that not only the 3 pillars as previously described, but also the association of each of these pillars with the 3 principal personalities in Freemasonry. And that you can see that based on the initials at the top of each pillar. He's also changed the design of the checkered floor. It now seems to be sort of stepped instead of the chessboard pattern that we had previously. And once again, we have the tracing board within the tracing board. On the top left-hand side, we have a white rectangle or oblong square, which has the 47th problem of Euclid from Pythagoras, and it's also got the letter T, which I think is probably, if we flick back to the previous slide, we can see in the top left hand here, it's a bit crude and maybe people didn't understand what that was meant to represent. So he's possibly put the letter T there to identify what that actually is. So in the board in the middle, this is the second degree board, and we can see here that John Brown has actually kept the 4 tassels in each corner that we were talking about previously on all 3 of the tracing boards that he has designed here. This is actually quite unique. Most artists only had the tassels on the first degree board, and Brother John Brown, it didn't seem to be a trend that kept on there. On the 3rd degree tracing board, which we see on the right-hand side, we have the 3 lodges of 5 fellowcraft being represented by 3 files of bees. The top file, there are actually only 4 bees, with the 5th one being represented by the figure pulling the shrub from the ground. We know that the beehive is a symbol that is regularly used in Freemasonry, and this might actually be one of the first examples of that association, where it's actually bees, and I know they're quite difficult to make out as bees, but that's what they are. And although it's not a beehive itself, this might be one of the first examples of that in the history of Freemasonry. Brother John Cole was a contemporary of Brown, who again followed the sort of flat chart pattern, and you can easily see the similarities across all of these designs. What's interesting about Brother Cole's versions is the diagonal checkered pavement that he has used on his 1st degree, and also the Greek key border, which he has used around the outer edge. Also, the blazing star has been hidden behind the centre of the Ionic pillar, which is quite interesting. And I love, just a personal thing, I love the fact that he's actually made the sun rising from behind the clouds. I think that's a very clever artistic thing that he's done there. Now, Brother Josiah Bowring was actually a portrait artist, and he used that to good use when he started designing tracing boards. This is actually a mixed set from different years between 1810 and 1820, and you can see a slightly different style, and the colouring is obviously slightly different in them as well. You can see that Bowring moves away from the flat minimalistic chart pattern, and particularly in his 1st degree boards, he's actually added a bit of depth with the positioning of the tools and the rough and the perfect ashlar. Also, this is the first time that we actually see the virtues of faith, hope, and charity being represented by female figures, as opposed to just the letters F, H, and C. And I appreciate it's quite difficult to see on this copy of the tracing board, but on the ladder we actually have the 3 cardinal virtues there of faith, hope, and charity. Finally, the key at the very bottom, on the white square near the bottom, is actually lying unusually on the floor, on the ground. This is actually corrected in later versions of Bowring's tracing boards, and brought into line with the emulation lecture, where it hangs by the thread of life from Jacob's ladder. In his 2nd degree tracing board, which we see in the middle here, he uses a split panel concept, with the top and the bottom panels showing different scenes. This was later used as a tool by Brother John Harris in his tracing boards, and I'm not sure if this is the first example of it, but it's certainly one of the earliest. One thing about Brother Bowring was definitely his way of portraying the tracing board of the 3rd degree. Although this is not unique, the open coffin was definitely a signature of this artist, and it's not something that we see an awful lot of going forward. There is a very good example, however, where he has a tracing board that's 2-sided, and on the uppermost side, the coffin is closed, and when you turn the coffin open, you turn the tracing board over, the coffin has been opened. I particularly like the example that's on the screen at the moment because of the little diagram in the right-hand corner showing the 3 ruffians in the entrance to the cave. Now, each of these designers would soon be overshadowed by an artist who was instrumental in the design of tracing boards, as we would know them today, and that's Brother John Harris that we mentioned earlier. His early example from 1820, pictured on the left here, is a clear progression of the chart pattern, but with elements of the more artistic styles of, say, Brother Bowring. This develops very, very quickly into a more and more artistic style. And in 1825, Harris actually produces, with the permission of His Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex, who was the Grand Master of UGLE, a special painted set of miniatures for each of the 3 degrees. And whilst the example on the screen at the moment is not the example, this gives you an idea of what he would have produced. This would come in a small binder, which could be a trifold, which could be folded in on itself and kept by members of the craft. And the initial one of this was done, as I say, for His Royal Highness, the Duke of Sussex. But these were later mass-produced, or at least as mass-produced as they could be at that time. In early examples of the Harris, from Harris, the second-degree tracing board, which we can see here, has the two great pillars flanking the staircase to the middle chamber. This was actually deemed to be a mistake, and it was later fixed in other examples by splitting the board into two parts, similar to what we saw from Brother Bowring before, showing the south porchway in one of the panels and the winding staircase in another. In 1945, the Emulation Lodge of Improvement launched a competition for an improvement on tracing boards. This was actually won by Brother Harris, and is probably the reason why we know this style of board so commonly today. And the boards that he produced for this particular competition are very much the same ones that we would expect to see around lodges, particularly in England. Now, this is a nice display of the progression of the designs for the third degree tracing board of Brother John Harris. It goes from a very flat design, again on the left-hand side, through to the more artistic ones as the years start to progress, with a particular favourite of mine from 1850 here, as I think this is such a special way to depict the third degree tracing board, and is fairly unique to how other artists would choose to show this. Now, we quite commonly hear tracing boards today referred to as a Harris tracing board. What they're actually referring to there is the fact that it is in the Harris style, rather than it was a tracing board designed by Harris himself. And usually it's in the similar sort of style to the one from 1845. Now we can see here that we've added a lot of depth. There's also the scroll. Now the scroll, this is the first example of the scroll being added like this. And I have been informed by a brother who is far more knowledgeable about this than myself, that the Hebrew is actually wrong on the scrolls. And between 1845 and 1850, every Harris tracing board that was produced had incorrect wording of the Hebrew on the scrolls. And it's not actually until 1850, on the example we have on the screen at the moment, that that is corrected, which is quite interesting. One way to spot a Harris design rather than an actual Harris tracing board, the Harris tracing boards usually have Harris's name in the border that runs around the tracing board, although not on all of them, but it is a common feature. And also on the third degree board, as we can see here in 1845, the tools have an irregular spacing. A lot of the modern examples of a Harris style board have regular spacing between the tools. But as we can see here in 1850 as well, Harris always tended to go for a grouping of two tools and another tool sitting on its own. His reasoning for that, I'm not very sure, but I'm sure there probably is a reasoning. Jumping forward quite a lot, we go to 1937. These are designs by Lady Frieda Harris, who actually designed a lot of tarot cards. And this was part of her studies into the teachings of Jakob Steiner and Goethe on projective synthetic geometry. And as part of that, she created these three Masonic tracing boards. Now, I have no idea what projective synthetic geometry actually is. I am led to believe that it is something to do with the convergence of lines and the golden ratio and lots of mathematical principles. If any brother does know what projective synthetic geometry is, then by all means, I would love to hear from you so that I can speak a little bit more about it. But certainly, if you look at the first degree tracing board and you can see the convergence of the lines here. It gives us an idea of what was actually trying to be achieved in these tracing boards. What I like about these as well is it shows something completely different that can be achieved using a Masonic tracing board. The third degree tracing board in particular is very, very interesting. There's loads of different things going on here, but all the symbols are still present. Some final examples, we actually have the one on the left here that you can get from the Grand Lodge of Scotland website. They've gone for a sort of simple black and white version, but the elements are very similar to what we've looked at before. We have the example here from a modern artist, and his name escapes me at the moment. I don't know why it's not in my notes, I apologise. These were designed as a set for lodges in Hungary, and this is a very modern example, very modern artistic style, and very interesting to look at. But again, if you study in detail, you can see all the symbols are there, and the example that we looked at of the early European tracing boards is very much present in this example. In the middle here, we have a printed sort of mass-produced version of what is very common for European lodges. And on the far right-hand side, we have an interesting sort of photorealistic version of a tracing board that was done by Brother Gregory B. Stewart in America using Photoshop. And again, he's taken various elements and very cleverly managed to mix them all into the one tracing board. Now, whilst tracing boards are maybe not as popular as they once were, there are still artists out there, as we can see on the screen at the moment, that are designing tracing boards. And I know in my mother lodge, we don't do a tracing board lecture. I'd be interested to hear if there's any brethren here today who have in their lodge that do a tracing board lecture. But there are other forms of tracing boards that seem to be emerging. I know a practice, certainly in America, that I've heard about is using slides and PowerPoints to show the various elements of a tracing board as a presentation. And also in my mother lodge, Lodge Kelburn, we actually do a walk around lecture in the second degree. And it didn't dawn on me until I started looking into a lot of this, that what we're actually doing is a sort of 3D tracing board for the benefit of the candidate. And I know there are walking charges and things, but I found that quite interesting when I started looking into the history of all this. So finally, whilst they are interesting to look at, I don't think we should forget that the tracing board has a real purpose, and it is for the master or the Freemason to lay out the plans for the work that lies ahead. As Freemasons, I think that we should all have our own personal tracing board to help us with the work that lies ahead. This may be as simple as a to-do list, as complex as a business plan, or as artistic as some of the examples that we've seen today. The example I have on the screen at the moment is a tracing board that I am working on in pencil, and my interpretation of a tracing board. And I'm hoping to be able to spend a bit of time working on that in the near future. I've neglected it slightly in the recent weeks. And I would like to finish by asking you, brethren, to take some time today to consider, after the presentation, what plans are on your tracing board. And thank you very much for your time, and again, for inviting me here today to give this presentation. Thank you.
Brother Scott Watson, on behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi, our members and all our guests here at the Lockdown Lecture Series, can I thank you so much, sir, for your endeavours this evening. Your personal talent shines through, your love and admiration for not only the art and craft of Masonry, but this subject that you found particular fondness for, the designs of the tracing board, has certainly shone through. And we all very much look forward to the day that we can see your final creation of that finished tracing board, and we look forward to sharing that. So Scott, thank you so much. There are a few questions for you. I've watched them coming in.
I do apologise because the chat wasn't showing up on my screen, but I could see the notifications coming in. So I thought, well, there's going to be lots of questions, which is always good.
Let me see. I'm just going through the chat. Neil, if you can send me your email, Neil from Zimbabwe, we can arrange that and we can put you in contact with the relevant people. So we can do that. So thank you. One of them being the Grand Master Mason, no less, Neil. So he's a past master of that lodge now. And I think Brother Alec Crabes here is a member, or he's a regular attender anyway. So we can solve that for you. But in terms of questions for you, Scott, Ian Walk asks, in Hogarth's illustration, what is the significance of the 4 characters on the left being labelled A, B, C, and D?
I'm not entirely sure about the labelling of them, but these were actually meant to represent the principal figures of the Gormagons. So what happened at the time of this, will I bring this up again so that we can see it? It was the Hogarth painting, wasn't it? Yep. I won't go full screen, just so that I can still see what's going on. I'm not entirely sure. I'm assuming it was some sort of key, is the short answer. But the characters that are being represented here are supposed to be the principal figures within the Gormagons. Now, there was a bit of a falling out around the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. And to put it in sort of a quick, not historically accurate wording, there was a bit of a falling out. Some people were treating it more like a drinking club. Others were going more for the sort of historical, ritualistic, operative side of it. There was a bit of a conflict between them. And in order to resolve this, there was a plot, shall we say, with regards to the creating this fictional organisation called the Gormagons, who supposedly came from the Orient, and they were supposed to be anti-Masonic. What actually happened was it became a real organisation. So there's quite an interesting history in that. I have looked into this, and I've published this on my my newsletter, and you can go back and look at that when we look at this particular image. So there's a bit more detail there. But yeah, that's why they're labelled A, B, C, and D. I think that's probably just a key to refer to who they are. But that's who they are. They're the principal figures of the Gormagons. Okay, thank you, Scott. And Brian, we will share Scott's website later on the Facebook pages this evening. In fact, Brother Michael Monroe has shared what the A, B, C, and D, who they are. He has. Thank you very much for that. Qin Huang Kaipo, first emperor of China, the sage Confucius, Incheon present ecumenical Volgai, and the Mandarin Hangchai. How's that, Michael, for pronunciation?
It's better than your French.
Thank you, sir. Scott, can you stop sharing so I can see the questions again, please? Certainly can. Thank you. And if I get back up to that, we had some excitement about the humming noise, and there was a couple of woes, and Ian Kennedy tells us that it was your earth loop humming. There's a couple of comments about the triangular layout in Royal Ark Mariner meetings and cryptic, but Brian, we won't go into those this evening because I don't know if we've got members of those. And this what is I will say, generic. What I will say about that, Gordon, if you don't mind, is that's when you're looking into this and you're researching this, it's very common to come across that with the Royal Ark Mariners. I am not part of that particular that particular order, but when you're searching the triangular form, it is very, very common. So if that is something that interests you, brethren, then there is quite a lot of information about it. And also make sure you don't go down the same rabbit holes that I went down
when I was looking into it.
We've got a Tandy salesman, for those of you who remember Tandy, as well, talking about your humming, Scott.
I've actually figured out whoever it was that said about the earth loop dropped a penny in my head, that it's actually the lead from my guitar, because it's not plugged into the guitar. So I do apologise, brethren. It's a bit late to figure it out now, but I do apologise.
At least you know for next time. Aubrey Winnie from Chile comments, Karmic, could the black and white square anomaly be answered by the parallel squares indicating the floor outside of the lodge?
Right, Aubrey, it's good to see you again. Thank you very much for being here. I know you've seen this presentation a couple of times, and that's an interesting. It's an interesting suggestion. It could. What I would say is I haven't found any evidence to support that's what it is, but I wouldn't say that it's not, because likewise I've not found any evidence to say that's not what it is. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in the presentation, archives and recording of what these things weren't always the greatest at this time. And unfortunately, it means we end up having to guess a lot of it.
Yeah, and Aubrey also noticed the three other candidates lying at the right-hand corner as well, in deep contemplation. Eagle mentions in Scandinavian craft lodges, first and second, the masons in that degree carry in the carpet as the degree is started and out at the end. That's an interesting difference as well.
Did not know that. Thank you for that. That's quite interesting.
Okay. Some more knowledge coming from Michael over in Paris. The knots are the lax d'amour, love knots, or widow's knots from the cords around a widow's heraldic arms. Thank you, Michael, for that.
Thank you very much.
Aubrey again, the Grand Lodge of Chile use the ancient accepted Scottish Rite ritual and do not use tracing boards.
Right.
Alan Turton, one of our own past masters, we have a binder with the various boards at Tapton Library in Sheffield. Willie Bartha, Ferenc Sibuk is the artist who made the boards in Hungary. He's a member in Lodge Grants from Budapest and also in some of the Belgium lodges. He's met him several times. So maybe a connection there through Willie Bartha for you.
And an extremely talented individual as well. That's obviously just one example that I shared today, but he has other examples of tracing boards and Masonic art that, brethren, I would recommend going and looking at.
I'll just think. Tom Edgar, the Deputy Master of Fisher Row, 112 over in Musselburgh. We don't have tracing boards as we walk the candidates through the lectures. And I would recommend, Brian, if anybody's not been to 112, Tom's hospitality is legendary, and I'm sure that after witnessing a fantastic degree with some American workings, he'll be first in line at the bar to buy you a wee pint or a can of Coca-Cola or something. But well worth a visit to 112, Brian.
So in 112, sounds like they do something similar to what we do in Kelburn, but do you actually display the tracing boards within the lodge? And if so, do you display the tracing board that is pertinent to that degree that you're in, or do you display all three at the same time? I would be interested to know if that's...
Tom, do you want to come in there?
Hi, Scott. No, we don't have any tracing boards whatsoever. Our senior deacon take the candidates through the second degree tracing board. Deputy Master explains the first degree, which is about 20 minutes long, and we go through the third degree with all the candidates through all the degrees. It's very different. We work an American style ritual, which is very different to everybody here. So yeah, we don't have any tracing boards whatsoever.
Excellent. That's nice to hear another sort of different working. And it's one of the things that I've found, as I'm sure, brethren, you're all aware, with Scottish Freemasonry in particular, is that no two things are the same. It's different wherever you go. I could cross the water from Millport, 8 minutes on the ferry, and go to Larg St John, and it would be completely different to what we would experience here in Kelburn. So,
Thank you, Tom. That leads on to a very nice point from Paul. Grand Lodge was and is quite keen on us using the standard ritual. Why is there not a standard tracing board? Well, I think that's not for us to challenge what Grand Lodge think or do, but maybe remind them of the sovereignty of Scottish lodges, daughter lodges, and what our choice of ritual and regalia, etc. is. Don't tell anybody I said that, brother Grand Almoner. But this is being recorded, I suppose they'll find out.
Interestingly, there is no such thing as a standard tracing board either, anywhere in the world. So even though there are jurisdictions that would have standard rituals, they don't actually have a standard tracing board. And I'm unsure, but I know there's certainly a lot of Grand Lodges in America that that don't even officially allow tracing boards. They've never actually accepted the fact that tracing boards are part of Freemasonry. However, I'm led to believe the lodges do actually use them.
Eagle tells us about in St John's, Newfoundland, several lodges do have lectures on the tracing board, both in the district Grand Lodges as well as the Grand Lodge of Newfoundland. Thanks, Eagle. Peter Clark, south of the border, the second degree board is normally given after the ceremony and the first degree done as a special event. And I think, Pete, we see that on a regular basis on the east coast of Scotland anyway, where the first degree is done tracing board is done separately out with the initiation. Uma, I will come back to you on your request about the PowerPoint and the text. I'll speak to Scott afterwards, and if so, I will drop you a message about that one. Michael with his helping me with my Confucius. Alan Turton again, Brother Pete Clark, Sheffield Ritual has lectures for all 3 degrees. Dickon, excellent lecture, a subject that fascinates me, but I'm summoned by the boss, so apologies, and you're probably already away by now, Dickon. Bob Potter, thank you for a very informative talk, a subject close to my heart. In '85, we have a mural carved from stone dated 1787, which is perhaps one of the earliest tracing boards, and it was one of the questions in the Provincial Grand Lodge of Linlithgow quiz a few months ago. But Scott, if you've not seen that, it's worth touching base with the Bren from Curtin Newton and Ratho.
Right, that sounds fascinating, and it's not something that I've come across before, so I would be delighted to see that and to learn about it.
Slider, most interesting, well done to all. First class lecture. Ian Kennedy, no tracing board used in Thistle 158. Alec Crabe in Lodge number 6 up in Inverness. Our tracing boards, which date back to the 17th century, pre-Grand Lodge of Scotland, hang on the wall behind curtains, but are not exposed in the degrees. Alan, a question to you, Brother Scott. Have you researched the use of emblematica communication, hidden information, i.e. John Dee and Francis Bacon?
I haven't, is the short answer to that.
That's when we get into the more esoteric side of life. And,
yep. I think it's something you would find very, very interesting. And it might even take you into the Rittman Library in Amsterdam in Holland.
Right, okay.
So a little bit for you.
Thank you.
Okay, Bren, that's us come to what looks like all the comments and questions. So once again, Scott, on behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi in our lockdown lecture series, can I thank you so much for your endeavours here this evening, and also your endeavours and the daily advancement that you've been taking yourself as a young Freemason, getting heavily involved in this research side. As the members of the Research Lodge here, we would commend you to continue making that daily advancement, but ensuring that you come along in the future and you're able to share the new knowledge that you've gleaned from your researches. Thank you so much. Brian, next. Good, Scott.
Sorry, Gordon. I just want to say thank you for that. I do really appreciate it, and I have found throughout this experience of looking into this, which is all relatively new, a lot of it came about when we went into lockdown with the pandemic, but I've found the help and guidance of brethren, many of which are here today, second to none. It's been absolutely superb, yourself included, Gordon. I really enjoyed our chat, and I know you've helped me with a few bits of research. So thank
Fivers
you.
in the post, it's all right.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that brethren have been kind. If there are any mistakes, they're waiting until afterwards to send me a message to let me know where my errors are. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Not at all. It's all a personal journey, Scott. So it's our own interpretations of our own personal tracing boards, as you said. Bren, next week, it's a great delight to welcome back Brother Rolf Kehl over from Germany, who's going to talk to us about the Convention of Williamsbad, the strict observance rites, and the Illuminati. The little I know about the strict observance, Bern, it's of great interest. It differs greatly from what we do here as Scottish Freemasons. So I look forward to welcome you all along here next Tuesday evening, same time, Bern, 7 o'clock, 6:45 for a bit of banter. And at this time, Bern, please unmute yourselves, say your thank yous to Scott and your good evenings. Thank you, Bern.
Thank you very much, Brother Scott.
Excellent
I
job.
enjoyed actually watching the whole thing. I missed the last time, but you did kindly send me the text. But reading it's not as good as hearing you with all the pictures. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you.
Brother
Well done,
Scott, that
Scott.
was absolutely super. Thank you very much.
Well done, Brother Scott. Excellent. Most interesting.
Yes, well done.
Thank you, Scott. Excellent lecture tonight.
Thank you, Brother Scott. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Brother Scott.
Thanks, Scott. Really enjoyed that. Very enjoyable presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Scott. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Well done.
Thanks, Scott. Excellent lecture again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. It was absolutely superb.
Well
I
done.
enjoyed every minute of it.
Thanks very much for your interesting lecture, Brother Scott. Take care, brethren.
Thank you, Scott. Excellent lecture.
Thank you, Scott. Well enjoyed it. Thank you.
And I'll give you 5, Bern.
Thanks very much, Brother Scott. And thank you, Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Gordon.
And 4, Bern.
Night, everybody.
Thank
Thank you, Zach.
Good night,
Thank
guys.
you, Brother
Stay
Scott.
safe.
Excellent lecture.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.
And 3,
Thank you very
Bern.
much. It's very much appreciated.
you.
I have put my email address in the chat for anyone that would like to follow up with any questions or anything afterwards. You're more than welcome to.
Okay,
Thanks, Brother Scott.
Yes, Scott.
And 2.
Right, Gordon.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks,
And 1,
Brother
Bern.
Scott. Good night, Gordon.
Thanks, Howard. Scott, on behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi, thank you so much, sir. We look forward to keeping in touch.